August 19th, 1991. A locked room on the Crimean coast. A woman is pressing her ear to a small radio, listening to the BBC report the collapse of everything her husband built. Outside, Soviet military vehicles circle the villa. The telephone lines are dead. She cannot call anyone. She cannot leave. Her name was Raisa Gorbacheva, wife of the man who ended the Cold War, the most celebrated Soviet woman in the Western world, and the most resented woman in her own country, at the exact same moment. When the radio went silent, she collapsed. This is the story of what it cost to stand beside the man who changed the world, and what the world never thought to ask her. There is a photograph taken in November 1985 in Geneva, Switzerland. Two women are sitting across from each other in a pale drawing room. Porcelain teacups. A fire burning somewhere off frame. Both women are dressed impeccably. One in a dark fitted suit, one in a rust-colored coat with a brooch at the collar. Both women are smiling. The cameras loved this photograph. The press called it the Tea Summit, because somewhere in the building next door, their husbands were deciding how many nuclear warheads to remove from the face of the earth. The fate of the world was in that other room. But every newspaper in the world ran this photograph. Two women smiling over tea at the edge of history. What those photographs did not capture, what photographs never capture, is what it costs to be in a room like that. What it takes out of you to hold that posture, hold that smile, hold that cup perfectly steady. When the world is watching, and the world has already decided what you are. One of the women in that photograph was Nancy Reagan, the wife of the President of the United States. The other was Raisa Gorbacheva. She was born in a railway car, or near one. Her father was a railway construction engineer, and the family moved so often across Siberia and the Ural Mountains that Raisa later said her childhood felt like a series of train departures. Always the new girl in a new village school. Always the one who had to prove herself from the beginning. She did, every single time. She became a philosopher, a sociologist. She earned a doctorate studying how ordinary Soviet citizens actually lived. She went into their homes, their farms, their cramped apartments, and she wrote it all down. She knew, more than most people in the Kremlin would ever know, what a life without privilege actually looked like. Then her husband's name appeared on a list, and then another list. And then, in March 1985, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the most powerful position in the second most powerful country on earth. And Raisa Gorbacheva stepped into a role that had never existed before. For more than 70 years, the wives of Soviet leaders had been invisible. Not by accident, not by oversight, by design. They stayed inside. They did not speak to journalists. They did not attend summits. They did not have opinions, or at least, they did not express them. They were the shadows behind the shadows. Raisa was different. She appeared at her husband's side at public events. She spoke to the Western press. She wore tailored suits and high heels in a country where most women owned 2 dresses. She had opinions about Russian culture, about heritage, about women's participation in public life. She expressed them. The West was enchanted. The Soviet Union was not. What followed, through the 6 years Gorbachev led the Soviet Union, through the summits in Geneva and Reykjavik and Washington, through the trembling years of glasnost and perestroika, through the August night in 1991 that would mark her in ways no one fully understood until much later, is not a story about politics. It is not a story about the Cold War, or the Nobel Peace Prize, or the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is a story about what it means to be the person standing next to the person who changes the world. What it costs, what it breaks, and what remains when the applause has gone quiet and the cameras have been put away. This is the story of Raisa Gorbacheva. She was always the new girl. That is the detail Raisa herself returned to, years later, when she tried to explain who she was before the cameras found her. Not the doctoral degree, not the philosophy lectures, not the fitted suits that would one day make headlines in Paris and London and Washington. She returned to this, the feeling of walking into a classroom where every face already knew every other face, and knowing that you would have to earn your place before you could breathe. Her father, Maxim Titarenko, was a railway construction engineer, a man whose work took him wherever the Soviet state needed rails laid through rock and ice and frozen earth. Rubtsovsk, in the Altai region of western Siberia, in 1932. Then the Ural Mountains, then Sterlitamak, then somewhere else. The family followed. Raisa was the eldest of 3 children, and she carried that responsibility the way eldest children always do, quietly and completely. The years of her childhood were not gentle years in the Soviet Union. Collectivization had stripped whole villages of their grain. The war came. Then the long gray hunger of the aftermath. Raisa later said she remembered those years not as trauma, but as texture. The particular weight of a winter coat worn through at the elbows, the specific smell of a room heated by a single iron stove, the way her mother's face looked in the morning before anyone had spoken. She also remembered being at the top of her class, every single time. In every school, in every new town, before she had made a single friend, she had already made her mark on the blackboard. In 1949, she graduated from secondary school in Sterlitamak with a gold medal. She was 17 years old. She packed one bag and moved to Moscow. Moscow State University in the early 1950s was a different world. Enormous, ambitious, crowded with young people who had survived the war and intended to make something of what survived. Raisa studied philosophy. She was serious about it in the way that people are serious when they have had to earn every opportunity they have ever been given. It was there, in the dormitory corridors and the lecture halls and the parks along the Moscow River, that she encountered a young man from Stavropol named Mikhail Gorbachev. He noticed her immediately. She did not immediately notice him. In the memoir he would publish decades later, a book he dedicated entirely to her memory, its cover bearing her portrait, Gorbachev described those first weeks with a candor unusual for a man who spent his career choosing words carefully. "I felt I was losing my head," he wrote. "I wanted to see Raisa and be wherever she was." He told her so. She told him she did not want to date him. She was recovering from another painful chapter, and she was not ready. He told her, according to his own account, that he could not honor that request, that it would be a catastrophe for him. That was his confession of love. They first kissed during a thunderstorm in a Moscow park when they had gone swimming and the sky split open without warning. Gorbachev wrote that he remembered her face in a flash of lightning, the scared, questioning eyes, and that he held her and kissed her, clumsily, and that the storm did not stop. They married in September 1953. She was 21. He was 22. Then the dream contracted, as it does. Gorbachev had been assigned to work in Stavropol, a provincial city in the south of Russia, far from the universities and the theaters and the research libraries that had defined Raisa's world for 4 years. She followed him there. Of course she did. They were young and in love, and the Soviet Union did not offer many options for renegotiating your husband's posting. What she found in Stavropol was something she had not anticipated. She could not find work. Not for lack of qualification. She had a philosophy degree from one of the most prestigious universities in the country. She spoke well. She was rigorous, methodical, sharper than most of the men she would encounter in the institutional corridors of that provincial city. None of it mattered. She was an outsider, a well-educated Muscovite in a region that preferred its women to remain in the background. She was offered positions she was not trained for. She was paid less than male colleagues with inferior credentials. She was, as she later said, given no real rights in the early years of her career. She did not leave. She did not collapse. She turned her frustration into research. It was during those Stavropol years that Raisa began the work that would become her doctoral dissertation, a sociological study of the daily lives of collective farm workers in the region. She went into their homes. She sat at their kitchen tables. She asked about their hours, their incomes, their children, their dreams, the distance between what the Soviet system had promised them and what it had delivered. She filed it all away. In 1957, their daughter Irina was born. In 1967, Raisa defended her doctorate. By then, Mikhail Gorbachev was already moving upward through the layers of the Communist Party. Local, then regional, then national, with a steadiness that marked him as exceptional. When the family moved back to Moscow in 1978, Raisa returned to teaching, lecturing in Marxist-Leninist philosophy at Moscow State University. She resigned the position in April 1985. Her husband had just become the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. What no one in the Kremlin had prepared for, what no protocol covered because no protocol had ever needed to, was what Raisa Gorbacheva intended to do with the role she had been handed. The tradition in Soviet political life was clear. The wives of the general secretaries did not appear. Khrushchev's wife attended almost no public events. Brezhnev's wife was almost entirely unknown to the Soviet public. The woman before Raisa, Anna Chernenko, wife of the previous general secretary, had been barely glimpsed in a year of her husband's leadership. Invisibility was not an oversight. It was the requirement. Raisa stepped out anyway. She appeared at her husband's side at public receptions. She gave interviews to foreign journalists. She accompanied Gorbachev to Paris in October 1985, where she attended private fashion shows by Yves Saint Laurent and Pierre Cardin. The first time a Soviet First Lady had ever engaged directly with Western haute couture. The photographs circled the globe. At home, the reaction was immediate and unforgiving. Soviet women, millions of them, who owned 2 dresses, who stood in queues for bread and soap, who had never seen a woman in a position of power dress like this, or speak like this, or simply exist like this at the side of a leader, looked at Raisa on their television screens and felt, many of them, something close to anger. She knew this. She was a sociologist. She had sat at their kitchen tables. People would ask, who does she think she is? A member of the Politburo? Gorbachev later recalled the rumors that circulated, the jokes about the Red Tsarina, the whispers that she was the one who actually made the decisions. She was attacked in the Duma for accepting a salary for her work at the Soviet Cultural Foundation. There was one detail that almost no one knew. The woman the Soviet public believed was shopping in the fashion capitals of the world was doing something rather different. According to accounts confirmed by Gorbachev himself, Raisa used to quietly sell her clothes at a second-hand store after wearing them only a few times. The general secretary's salary did not stretch to a new wardrobe. It never had. She wore the clothes, she sold them back. She wore different ones. And the country that watched her on television continued to believe it knew who she was. The world had its first real look at Raisa Gorbacheva. Geneva, the shores of Lake Leman. 3,500 journalists had gathered from every country on earth to watch two men, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, sit across from each other for the first time and decide whether the nuclear standoff that had defined the previous 40 years would continue, ease, or end entirely. The stakes were, in the most literal sense, the survival of civilization. And the photograph that ran on the front page of newspapers from London to Tokyo was two women drinking tea. The press called it the Tea Summit. It was not a joke, or not entirely. Both women were considered influential advisors to their husbands. Both were known to be formidable presences behind closed doors. The choreography of their meeting, who sat where, who poured first, who spoke and who listened, was treated by diplomatic observers with the same seriousness as the seating arrangements in the negotiating room next door. Nancy Reagan arrived having been briefed extensively on Raisa Gorbacheva. Raisa arrived having been briefed on almost nothing, because the Soviet system did not brief wives. What happened over those 2 days of tea and careful smiles has been described differently by everyone who was present. Nancy Reagan later dismissed reports of tension as silly. But the reports persisted, that Raisa had lectured rather than conversed, that she had recited Soviet ideology with a docent's precision, that Nancy had found her humorless and relentless. A year later, at the Reykjavik summit in Iceland, Raisa arrived despite an apparent understanding that spouses would not attend, and reports at the time suggested Nancy Reagan was not pleased. Reagan's spokesperson subsequently said the reports were overstated. What is documented, and what no one disputed, is the visual effect of Raisa's presence at both summits. She was unlike anything the Western world had been offered before from the Soviet side of the table. The previous leaders' wives, those rare occasions when they had appeared at all, had been elderly women in dark coats, standing slightly behind their husbands, offering nothing to the camera. Raisa was 53 years old, composed, visibly intelligent, dressed with an attention to detail that communicated something deliberate. She talked to journalists. She had things to say. Of course, in the West, she had a very dramatic effect in terms of making the Russians seem more human. Oliver Waits, the Reuters Moscow bureau chief during those years, said later, "All of these gruff and unsmiling Russian leaders of the past, suddenly here's a man who is not only jolly himself, but has a real ordinary wife with him." Ordinary. The Western press used that word about Raisa as a compliment. In the Soviet Union, it landed differently. Back home, something was hardening. The women who watched Raisa on Soviet state television, the ones she had once interviewed for her doctoral research, the ones who stood in queues and managed households on salaries that stretched only to the middle of the month, were not moved by the same qualities that enchanted the foreign press. They saw a woman who changed her designer clothes twice daily when visiting Chernobyl victims. They saw fur coats at the site of the Armenian earthquake. They saw, as one observer put it, a woman whose image was too remote from their own reality to be credible. Jokes spread through Moscow like cold air under a door. The Red Tsarina. Gorbachev's Josephine. People asked, according to Gorbachev's own later account, "Who does she think she is? A member of the Politburo?" There was also the question of influence. Rumor, persistent and unverifiable, held that Raisa shaped her husband's political decisions. That the anti-alcohol campaign he launched in 1985 was her doing. That she sat in on meetings she should not have attended. That the general secretary consulted his wife before he consulted his advisors. Gorbachev denied this emphatically in his memoirs. "Those constant stories that she took political decisions or put pressure on me are nonsense," he wrote. "She didn't even know how the Politburo worked." Whether the rumors were true or false, they were effective. A woman who was visible was a woman who could be blamed. In June 1988, Raisa Gorbacheva appeared on the cover of Time magazine. She was the first Russian woman ever to be so honored. The photograph showed her in a red suit, direct gaze, entirely composed. The cover line positioned her as a symbol of the new Soviet Union, of glasnost, of perestroika, of the tentative opening that Gorbachev was attempting to engineer between his country and the rest of the world. She was, by any measure, at the height of what this role could offer. And yet, the things that did not appear in the Time magazine photograph, the salary disputes, the Duma attacks, the jokes that circulated in every city from Leningrad to Vladivostok, the second-hand store, the isolation of being the first person to occupy a role that had no office, no staff, no formal title, no precedent, and no protection. In the United States, a first lady had a chief of staff, a press secretary, a social secretary, a team of schedulers and advance staff. In France, in Britain, there were structures, imperfect ones, but structures. In the Soviet Union, there was nothing. Raisa had once told an interviewer that the role of a Soviet leader's wife was to be, as she put it, a rose in her husband's lapel. She had spent her entire adult life refusing to be decorative. Now the country expected nothing else. She stood at summits where the fate of the world was decided, and poured tea, and smiled for cameras, and listened to what was said in the rooms she was permitted to enter. And she did not say what she thought about the rooms she was not. That was the bargain. That was always the bargain. And for 6 years, through Geneva and Reykjavik and Washington and Moscow, through the impossible balancing act of being too much for one country and exactly right for another, she kept it. Until the summer of 1991, when the bargain was broken for her. There is a version of Raisa Gorbacheva that history preserved very carefully. The version in the photographs. The version on the Time magazine cover. The version that walked beside her husband through the marble corridors of summit venues in Geneva and Washington and Reykjavik. Her posture perfect, her expression composed, her clothes always precisely right for the occasion. That version was real, but it was also a construction, not a deception exactly, but a surface. And beneath the surface, as beneath all surfaces, there was something the cameras could not reach. Consider what the role actually required. There was no office, no staff, no budget allocated to her work, no title that carried legal weight, no formal position in any structure of the Soviet state. When Raisa accompanied Gorbachev to a summit, she was there as a wife, which meant she was there on sufferance, present because her presence had been decided to be useful, able to be uninvited at any moment without explanation or recourse. At Reykjavik in 1986, that almost happened. The summit was called at short notice, and spouses had not been part of the original plan. Raisa came anyway. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that if she did not insist on being present, the space would simply close. She had no allies in the traditional sense. The wives of other Soviet officials kept their distance. Proximity to a woman this visible was its own kind of risk. The foreign dignitaries who admired her at summits went home. The journalists who wrote glowing profiles of her in Paris and London and Rome had no presence in the apartment buildings of Leningrad and Novosibirsk, where ordinary Soviet women read those profiles with something between bewilderment and resentment. She was, in the precise meaning of the word, alone in her position. What Raisa did with that aloneness is instructive. She worked. In 1986, she co-founded the Soviet Cultural Foundation, later renamed the Russian Cultural Foundation, an institution dedicated to recovering and preserving cultural artifacts that had been removed from Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. Under her presidency, the foundation recovered more than 50,000 objects, paintings, manuscripts, icons, items of historical and artistic significance that had been dispersed across Europe and beyond during the upheavals of the 20th century. She did this without a government salary at first, and when she later accepted one for her work as vice president of the foundation, she was attacked in the Duma for it. In 1989, she donated $100,000 to the International Association of Hematologists of the World for Children, a charity that funded blood banks and trained Russian doctors to treat childhood leukemia. The donation came from her own resources. It was not announced with fanfare. The money went to buy equipment for hospitals that had almost none. Childhood leukemia. She chose that cause specifically. She had no particular personal reason to at the time. It was simply a need she had identified, and she had the means to address part of it. And so she did. Years later, the significance of that choice would become something no one could have anticipated. But in 1989, it was simply a woman doing what she could with what she had. The mornings belonged to them. This is the detail that Gorbachev returned to most often in the years after her death. Not the summits, not the speeches, not the historical weight of what they had witnessed together. The mornings. Every day, for 40 years, regardless of where they were or what the weather was, they walked together. Through the streets of Stavropol when they were young and unknown. Through the parks of Moscow when he was climbing through the party ranks. Through the grounds of whatever official residence or summit venue they happened to be in when history placed them somewhere extraordinary. One day we took each other by the hand and went for a walk in the evening, he told Vogue magazine in 2013. And we walked like that for our whole life. Raisa loved snowstorms, he said. When the weather turned bad, he would suggest they stay inside. She would say no. They went anyway. Those walks, unhurried, unrecorded, nobody's business but their own, were perhaps the only part of their life together that belonged entirely to neither the Soviet state nor the watching world. Everything else had an audience. The walks did not. It is worth pausing on this. Here was a man whose every movement was tracked by security services, whose schedule was managed by a bureaucracy of thousands, who had not made a genuinely private decision about his own time in years. And here was a woman whose every public appearance was analyzed, whose clothes were critiqued, whose very existence in the role she occupied was contested. And every morning, they walked. Simple, ordinary, entirely theirs. By 1990, something had shifted. The Soviet Union that Gorbachev had been trying to reform was not cooperating with the reforms. The Baltic states were moving toward independence. The economy was failing in ways that glasnost could illuminate, but perestroika could not fix. Hardliners within the party had concluded that the General Secretary had gone too far, that his openness to the West, his willingness to negotiate, his apparent belief that the Soviet system could be made humane, amounted to a betrayal of everything the party had been built to protect. Raisa felt this change as a change in the air of rooms. The particular quality of silence when she and Mikhail entered a gathering, the way certain people's eyes moved away, the smile that did not reach the eyes. She knew that smile. She had worn it herself in Geneva, and what it concealed. She had spent 6 years learning to read the surface of things. She knew when a surface was about to crack. In the summer of 1991, she and Mikhail traveled south to the Black Sea coast, to a government dacha in the Crimean resort of Foros, a place of white walls and sea breezes, and the particular peace of somewhere that felt, temporarily, removed from everything. They had no way of knowing. It would be the last peaceful thing. The morning of August 19, 1991, began like any other morning at the Foros dacha. The Black Sea was calm. The light came in off the water the way it does in that part of Crimea, flat and pale and generous, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly possible. Gorbachev had been working on a speech. Raisa had been reading. Their daughter Irina and her husband Anatoly were somewhere in the compound with their 2 granddaughters. The family was together, which was not always the case, and the particular ease of that, the simple fact of being in one place, all of them, with nothing immediately required, was something Raisa had learned not to take for granted. At 4:50 in the afternoon, a group of men arrived at the dacha without warning. They were senior officials, Gorbachev's own chief of staff among them, along with the head of the KGB, the defense minister, and several others. They had not called ahead. They had not been invited. They told Gorbachev that he must sign a document declaring a state of emergency in the Soviet Union, transferring effective power to a committee they had already formed. If he refused, they said, measures would be taken. Gorbachev refused. The men left. The telephone lines were cut within the hour. The communications equipment in the dacha, all of it, went dead simultaneously. Outside the perimeter, Soviet military vehicles took up positions. The family was, in every meaningful sense, under arrest. What followed were 3 days that Raisa would describe, in the weeks afterward, as the most terrifying of her life. She told journalists, in one of the few direct accounts she gave of those days, that she had been so convinced the conspirators intended to kill her entire family that she had suffered a severe attack of hypertension and problems with her speech, for which she was still receiving treatment 2 weeks later. She sat with Irina. She sat with the granddaughters. She sat with Mikhail, who was trying to maintain contact with the outside world through a small personal radio he had managed to keep. The BBC World Service was broadcasting. It was through that signal, crackly, intermittent, coming from somewhere beyond the military cordon outside, that the family received most of what they knew about what was happening in Moscow. That the vice president had declared himself acting president, that tanks had moved into the capital, that Boris Yeltsin had climbed onto one of those tanks outside the Russian parliament building and called on the people to resist, that Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, the man who had ended the Cold War, who had negotiated with Reagan and Thatcher and Kohl and Mitterrand, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize, was being described on Soviet state television as ill and unable to discharge his duties. Raisa listened to all of this on a smuggled radio in a locked room on the Crimean coast. On the final day, August 21st, the BBC began reporting that 2 planes were racing toward Crimea. One was sent by the coup plotters to manage the situation. The other was sent by the Russian government, loyal to Gorbachev, to bring him home. Raisa became convinced in those hours that the first plane to land would determine whether her family lived or died. According to the historian Serhiy Plokhy, who documented the events of those 3 days in his account of the Soviet collapse, it was in this moment that Raisa Gorbacheva broke. She collapsed into the arms of her daughter Irina and her son-in-law Anatoly. What the doctors would later classify as a severe hypertension attack had begun. Blood pooling in the vessels around her eyes, her speech suddenly impaired, partial paralysis spreading down one side of her body. The coup, it turned out, was already failing. The plotters had miscalculated. The army would not move against the people at the White House. The public had not accepted the emergency declaration. The men who had arrived at the Foros dacha 4 days earlier were now themselves in crisis. The loyal plane landed first, but Raisa did not know that yet. In the hours when she broke, she did not know anything except what her body had decided, that it had absorbed everything it could absorb, and that it was done. The footage of their return to Moscow, landing at 2:15 in the morning on August 22nd, was broadcast around the world. Gorbachev descended the steps of the plane, looking shaken but upright, the politician's posture still intact even at that hour, already moving toward the microphones. Behind him, Raisa had to be helped down the stairs. The woman who had walked into Geneva in high heels and a fitted suit, who had stood perfectly composed while cameras flashed from every direction, who had poured tea across from Nancy Reagan and given nothing away. That woman had to be helped down an airplane staircase at 2 in the morning in Moscow. She was 59 years old. She had hematomas around her eyes. She could not speak properly. The television cameras caught it all. The next morning, Gorbachev did something that no one in the Kremlin had anticipated, and that would be talked about in Russia for decades afterward. He did not go to the parliament. He did not go to the party headquarters. He did not go to the press conference that had been arranged, or the briefing, or the ceremony. He went to the hospital. "I was not married to the country, Russia or the Soviet Union," he wrote later. "I was married to my wife, and that night I went with her to the hospital." The bargain in that moment was not broken. It was simply, finally, revealed for what it had always been. Not a political arrangement, not a performance for the cameras that had followed them for 6 years. Something else entirely. 8 years passed. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991, 4 months after Foros, almost to the day. Gorbachev resigned the presidency on Christmas Day, handing over a country that was no longer the country he had been handed. The red flag over the Kremlin came down. A new flag went up. Boris Yeltsin was already governing Russia, and Mikhail Gorbachev was already, in the minds of most Russians, a figure of the past. The Gorbachevs moved out of the official residence. They became, in the way of former leaders everywhere, people who had once mattered and now occupied a different category. Present, but peripheral. Visible at certain formal occasions. Consulted sometimes, mostly not. In Russia specifically, the category was harsher than most. Gorbachev was not simply a former leader. He was, in the eyes of a significant portion of the population, the man who had lost the country. That was not a distinction that came with grace. Raisa continued her work. The Cultural Foundation, the Leukemia Charity, the Raisa Maximovna's Club which she established in 1997 to encourage women's participation in political life. She lectured. She wrote. She did what she had always done. She filled the space available to her with something useful, and she did it without the cameras that had once followed her everywhere, because the cameras had moved on to other subjects. The walks continued, every morning, whatever the weather. In the summer of 1999, Raisa Gorbacheva began to feel unwell. The diagnosis, when it came, was acute leukemia, a rare and aggressive form of blood cancer. She was 67 years old. The Gorbachev family made the decision to seek treatment in Germany, at the University Hospital in Münster, where specialists in the condition practiced. She was admitted on July 25, 1999. Mikhail Gorbachev did not leave. He stayed in Münster for the entirety of her treatment. Weeks that stretched into the particular suspended time of hospital corridors and specialist consultations, and the slow accumulation of information that never quite adds up to certainty. He spoke to journalists every day from outside the clinic, which was something no former Soviet leader had ever done. Not because there was anything new to report, but because he could not be silent. He was a man who had spoken to the world for years, and now he had only one thing to say, and he said it in every way available to him. She was still here, and he was with her. Some historians, including Serhii Plokhy, have suggested that the physical collapse Raisa suffered during those 3 days at Foros in 1991, the hypertension attack, the stroke, the shock to her system, may have been the beginning of what became, 8 years later, the leukemia that killed her. The medical connection cannot be stated as established fact, but the possibility has never been dismissed entirely. What is certain is this. The woman who had donated $100,000 to a childhood leukemia charity a decade before her own diagnosis, who had helped fund the blood banks and train the Russian doctors who treated the disease, now lay in a German hospital receiving the treatment that her own philanthropy had helped make possible in her home country. She had given money to fight a disease she did not yet know she had. Then something happened that no one had predicted. When the news of Raisa's illness became public, the letters began to arrive. Thousands of them. From across Russia, from the cities and the towns and the villages, from the women who had watched her on television for 6 years and felt something between bewilderment and resentment, from the people who had told the jokes about the Red Tsarina, from the men who had argued in their kitchens that she had too much influence, from the ordinary Soviet citizens whose lives she had once documented in her doctoral research and who had never forgiven her for having left that world behind. They wrote to her. They sent flowers. They sent money. To the Gorbachev Foundation, addressed to her recovery, from people who had very little money to send. Gorbachev read the letters. Every one of them, as far as anyone could tell. He sat in that hospital corridor in Münster and read the words that the people of Russia had finally found for this woman. The words they had not been able to find, or had not chosen to find, while she was well and visible and easy to resent. The twist of it, the particular, devastating twist, is not that they had been wrong about her all along. People are rarely entirely wrong. The twist is the timing, the love that arrives at the bedside, the flowers that come when the person can no longer walk to the window to see them. She had spent her life being the first person to do things no one had done before. She was, in this too, the first Soviet leader's wife to be mourned before she had finished dying, by a country that had never quite figured out how to love her while she was alive. On September 20th, 1999, at the University Hospital in Münster, Germany, Raisa Maximovna Gorbacheva died of circulatory and organ failure. She was 67 years old. Mikhail Gorbachev was at her side. Their daughter Irina was at her side. Gorbachev left the clinic afterward without speaking. A hospital spokesperson confirmed the cause of death. Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev's political nemesis, the man who had humiliated him on national television after the failed coup. The man who had, in many ways, ended his political career, ordered a state aircraft sent to Germany to bring her body home. She was buried at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, the resting place of some of the most significant figures in Russian history, with full honors. Later, in a diary entry written 1 year after her death, Gorbachev recorded what he was left with. "My life has lost its principal meaning," he wrote. "I have never had such an acute feeling of loneliness." After she was gone, Gorbachev stopped walking. Not immediately, not all at once. But the mornings that had belonged to both of them, the 40 years of daily walks through whatever weather the season offered, the snowstorms she had insisted on, the parks and the streets and the grounds of summit venues in cities they had visited together. Those mornings became, without her, something he did not know how to inhabit. He had told her once, when the weather was bad, "Let's stay inside." She had said no. They went anyway. She was gone now. The snow fell, without instruction. He continued working, in the way that people who have been defined by work continue working when work is all that is left. He wrote. He gave interviews. He maintained the Gorbachev Foundation. He advocated, in the years that followed, for the things he had always believed in: dialogue over confrontation, openness over secrecy, the possibility that history did not have to repeat its worst chapters. Russia did not particularly want to hear it. The country had moved on to a different kind of leader, a different set of certainties. Gorbachev became, in the Russian imagination, a figure of the previous century, present, occasionally consulted, mostly set aside. In 2009, a decade after her death, he released a compact disc. It was called Songs for Raisa, 7 romantic songs recorded with the musician Andrei Makarevich. Gorbachev sang on them, the man who had negotiated nuclear arms treaties and addressed the United Nations, who had accepted the Nobel Peace Prize and watched the Soviet flag lowered for the last time, who had been celebrated in the West and resented at home, sang love songs for his dead wife and released them to the public. The proceeds went to the charities she had founded. It was, by any conventional measure, an unusual thing for a former head of state to do. It was also the most honest thing he had done in years. At Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, the burial ground of Chekhov, of Bulgakov, of Shostakovich and Prokofiev, of figures who had shaped Russian culture across 2 centuries, a stone was placed over Raisa's grave. Above it, a sculptor carved her likeness in full, life-size, standing. The figure looks forward, not downward, not mourning, not diminished, present, the way she had always insisted on being present. Beside the statue, a space was left. It waited. For more than 2 decades, Gorbachev lived in Russia, while his daughter and grandchildren lived in Germany, the country where Raisa had died, the country that had treated her in her final weeks, the country whose language none of them had grown up speaking. The distance between them was the distance that history makes between people, when it has finished using them. He gave his last major interview in 2022. He was 91 years old. He spoke about Ukraine, carefully, as he had always spoken about painful things, and about the necessity of dialogue, and about what was lost when people stopped believing that their adversaries were also human beings. He did not say her name in that interview, but he did not need to. She was in every sentence that was about the cost of silence, the price of pride, the things that cannot be recovered once they are gone. On August 30th, 2022, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev died at the Central Clinical Hospital in Moscow after a prolonged illness. He was 91 years old. Vladimir Putin did not attend the funeral. Several thousand ordinary Russians did. On September 3rd, 2022, they carried his coffin to Novodevichy Cemetery. The military band played the national anthem. There was a gun salute. And then they lowered him into the ground beside her. Beside the stone figure that had stood over that empty space for 23 years, in all weathers, through all the changes that had come to the country they had tried, in their different ways, to serve. He had told a journalist once, years earlier, how it had ended for him. The walks, the mornings, the 40 years of simply being alongside another person. Raisa died, he said, and then I stopped walking. The snow falls on Novodevichy Cemetery the way it falls everywhere in Moscow, without asking permission, without adjusting itself to the occasion. In winter, the stone figure above the grave accumulates it slowly, the way stone accumulates everything, without resistance, without complaint. She had always loved snowstorms.